Today I'm going to be talking about the most underrated book in the Wheel of Time. You could also say most overhated, but it's mostly derived from just how the book is sold when talking to just really any Wheel of Time fan that I've seen recommending this series, because The Eye of the World, it gets that, the first couple of books are okay, and then it gets really good later on. And to an extent, I can at least see where they're coming from. I do think that book 6, the finale of Winter's Heart, and then especially when it comes to like book 12 and 14, I think that those are some of the best books in the series. But realistically, 1 through 6 at that point are all incredibly good books. And then when talking specifically about the first 3, these are the ones that do get that stipulation, like these books are okay, but the series really starts to shine at book 4. I think that those first 3 books really are underrated. And I think at the top of that list, for me at least, is Eye of the World, because this book really doesn't have any weak points for me. Like, just looking through the different chapters and the arcs that take place in this book, I think that all of them are super solid. In all honesty, like starting from, the prologue where we see Luz Theron, I think that it's one of the best prologues that I've read. Like, Stormlight, of course, comes pretty close when it comes to like Zeth's storyline, or even the prelude, I think is pretty good. Having both of those was definitely a decision, but the prologue for Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World with Luz Theron, I think is fantastic. And then mostly moving on when it comes to the 2 rivers, this is where I want to get to one of the biggest criticisms of this book that I think does have a degree of merit to it, but I think gets vastly blown out of proportion, and that is the comparisons to Lord of the Rings, because this book is undoubtedly, and I think just very blatantly, inspired by Lord of the Rings, and it's an aspect of the book that I like. But there are some things that are pretty on the nose, but just generally the comparisons to Lord of the Rings, when it comes to the Wheel of Time, I think that it's very surface level, and when it comes to the deeper concepts within this book series and Lord of the Rings, they're just vastly different. Mostly when it comes to the stuff that's very on the nose, you could say like the Black Rider specifically, even though they have a lot of difference between the Nazgul and the Murdral, like they're very different from one another. Something that I really like about the Nazgul is the history that they have, while I think the Murdral do have that mythology surrounding them, like how they're, supposedly like 20 feet tall, and then they can turn and just disappear completely. I really like that aspect of the Murdral. But then when it comes to things that are similar but very different, the moment you strip away that surface level, is like Emond's Field, the Emond's Fielders, specifically their culture. Once you compare it to the Shire, I think that comparison really does start to fall apart, because of course the Shire, they're all peaceful hobbits, but then, and that's part of the narrative and what makes them such unexpected heroes, but then you get to Emond's Field, where their ancestors was Manetheren, and the warrior cult. I wouldn't say necessarily like super warrior culture, but they were a warrior kingdom fighting against most importantly Trollocs, during the Trolloc Wars and even before that. But Manetheren, I think that having the roots there does really set this place, or Emond's Field, apart from the Shire. And then you can go deeper than that with a bunch of different characters like Moraine, where she has a lot more in common with Bene Gesserit than she does with like the Gandalfs and other wizards, but especially like Gandalf specifically. She has more in common with a lot of other series. And I think that's where a lot of these comparisons really start to fall apart as well, because there are other inspirations, whether it be, culturally, with more Eastern philosophies and Eastern cultures having a part in this narrative, and then of course the other works like Dune, which has such a heavy hand. I wouldn't say as heavy of a hand as Lord of the Rings when it comes to its influence, but still it's second place, I think, without a doubt, when you're not considering different cultures. But then spinning off of what I just said, where I'm talking about all the differences between the two, I do not like a portion because I think it's too much on the nose, and that's the Tarn Ferry arc. And it's mostly just because when it comes to them being chased down by the Black Riders, I just see the scene from Fellowship of the Ring where just it is very much the same thing. They're taking a ferry, being chased down by their Black Riders, the Nazgul. So the scene with the Murdra and the Nazgul chasing down our main characters on a ferry, like, it's too similar. And I get it, there is a point to be made here, especially at the very end with Moraine and what she does to the ferry afterwards. Like, there is a point to this little mini arc, and when it comes to sowing distrust between our characters and the one guiding them, and I can appreciate that at least. But when it comes to just how on the nose this feels, yeah, this was one of my lesser appreciated parts of the story. But then that kind of rolls into Belron, which is one of my favorite chapters, or I don't want to say chapters, but series of chapters. I think it's about 3 or 4 chapters that take place in Belron. And this is why I think that Eye of the World really starts to find its footing. We get a little characterization between like Matt and Rand and their interactions with the White Cloaks, not to mention some foreshadowing there. But then I think that the characters that aren't just the main characters really start to come in their own. We start to see more of Lan and Moraine. And then, of course, Nynaeve comes back, and, Perrin is doing his thing. And then we get the reappearance of the Peddler. So I like a lot of what's going on in Belron. And then kind of just continuing from that, building to one of, I think, the first pivotal points within this first book is them going into Shadar Logoth. And I loved this portion of the book, and I can see the comparisons between this part of the story and what happens with the Balrog, but it feels so distinctly different. And the comparisons, I think, are pretty shallow, other than it's a very ominous, abandoned, ancient place. But aside from that, I don't really think that the comparison fits all that well. Of course, the comparison can still be made, but like I said, it's a very surface level thing. But what's most important when it comes to Shadar Logoth is at the end of this little mini arc within the story, our characters all split up and go different ways. And while I think that the series, the book really started to find its footing when it came to Belron, I think undoubtedly the Wheel of Time's status as kind of coming into its own is without a doubt at this point in the story. Because once you get to the Wolf Brothers storyline with Perrin, and then the Play for Your Supper storyline with Matt and Rand, like, it's such a distinct feeling, and I love both of those arcs so much that I really dislike the idea that the series is still just a complete ripoff of Fellowship of the Ring. Because at this point, I don't really think that point can be made anymore. It feels distinctly different. So I think at that point, it's kind of, I think I've made my point when it comes to just how disingenuous I think a lot of the arguments are when it comes to the comparisons between Lord of the Rings and this first book, The Eye of the World. I think that some comparisons are valid, but the idea that it's a copy of Fellowship of the Ring, I think, is just you didn't read much of the book, in my opinion, if that's really your takeaway. And that leads me to talking about just how few weak spots this story has. I already talked about Tarn Ferry and how I didn't really like that portion of the story, but from that little hiccup there and then here on, there's not a portion of the story that I really dislike. And especially given retrospect, because I think some things can be tough on the first read through. Maybe the Matt and Rand stuff is a little slow for people, but even on my first read through, I remember that being my favorite storyline, or at least arguably so. The Wolf Brothers storyline with Perrin is really good, and when it comes to this first book and my first read through, Perrin was my favorite character. And I think it all stems from the Wolf Brothers storyline, his interactions with Stepper Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name right now. But his interactions with the wolves, and specifically the one that would become his best friend among the wolves, I think is fantastic. And just the threat of the White Cloaks, these people that aren't necessarily the main enemies of this book, but when it comes to intertwining them with Perrin and just the world building surrounding the White Cloaks just as a people and what it means, like the religious zealots within this world. And it comes up again in different ways with the Dragon's Horn and whatnot, but the White Cloaks were really the first iteration of that, and I think that they were the better. What is really hard to appreciate, I think, on this first read through in this first book is the stuff with Moraine, Lan, and Nynaeve. And that's just because Nynaeve, she's a tough character to really attach to, especially in these early books when you don't have the context of the full series. Because, of course, in the end, I think she becomes probably the character that changed the most. Like, there's the most character development with Nynaeve, and upon your first read through, you're not going to know that her character is going to be unlikable throughout this entire book, and there's not really any reason to appreciate her character. So a lot of this book, I think, just increases its value when it comes to retrospect and rereads, and that could influence my decision here. But even upon my first read through, I really loved this book. And while I do think that the play for your supper storyline with Mat and Rand, and especially that scene where we get another example of foreshadowing with Rand, with one of the most I think intense moments early on within the series when it comes to them being cornered, and this very mysterious way that they end up getting freed from being cornered here. I can't even remember what I thought had happened in my first read through. I thought that they had gotten rescued, kind of in like some Luffy and how he got rescued from his dad, but they just don't really know who they got saved from. Like, I remember coming up with some just very far from the truth theories when it comes to everything going on with Rand and Mat at that moment. But even the slower moments I really loved. But that leads into Caemlyn, which it might be, in retrospect, be my favorite storyline of this book. The stuff when it comes to Rand and Logain, and even the stuff with him and Elaine. I think I liked Elaine and Gawain in this book more than almost any other book throughout the entire series, especially Gawain, because he does have one of the most significant fall-offs of any character that I think I've ever experienced. He's one of the most hated for a reason, but unfortunately I think he had potential here. I liked his character. I liked Elaine's. I liked their whole dynamic. And then, of course, the Ogier getting introduced here, which they feel very, they have that inspiration, I think, from the Ents. And it's the furthest from a bad thing. I love the Ents in the Two Towers, and I like the Ogier throughout most of this. I don't think they're as good, but I do think in the same way that the Black Riders, the Eyeless in this, are different from the Nazgul, but not as good. I think the same thing goes for the Ogier. They're very different from the Ents, but at the same time, I don't think that they're as good, but especially loyal. I mean, he's among the best characters in this entire story, and we get introduced to him here. His dynamic with Rand throughout all of the books, and even here, is fantastic, and I love this part of the story as well. And then kind of ending off with the Ways and Faldara. The Ways is one of the cooler concepts within this story. They do end up coming up with other ways of traveling long distances and shorter periods of time, but the interest of the waves and how we never really get a true answer with them. I don't really think that there is a problem with that because of just how mysterious they are, and it's just one of my favorite aspects of this early book is the tone during the portion that our characters go through the ways. Ending off with Faldara, I really enjoy most of what happens here, if not all of it. I like the concept of the Green Man, just all the extra bits when it comes to the antagonists of the series finally showing themselves, the Forsaken, and we're getting introduced to those types of characters. I think that the execution of this ending is really good, and it does make sense when you think that there probably wasn't there wasn't a plan for further books. I don't think, like, there was probably a plan, but if this was the only book, like, I think this would have been just a very solid one book series. And I do think that ended up making some problems in the long run, because the first three books, the climax of the first three books, a very same feeling, and I think people that have gone through these books know exactly what I'm talking about. But if the foresight could have been there, and this is very much, I wouldn't even say it's hindsight 2020, but I think that's the closest thing I can think of to really compare what I'm talking about here. But if the foresight could have been there, like, hey, this book series is going to be 14 books long, we probably shouldn't end the first three books this way, that would have probably been for the best. But when it comes to this first book, and if this would have been the only one, I don't think that there would even be any problems with the ending. I loved this entire book. I think that has been the entire point that I've been trying to make throughout this, that it is not, a lesser book, that it should really set the expectations. You should really set your expectations low going into this book. I don't think it's necessary, but I do think it does help when it comes to selling the series. Let's say you finish this book and you're like, okay, that's among the worst that it can get, and then you kind of move past that point going into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then that's like just a streamline, I think, of some of the better fantasy books that I've read. And I guess in that function, I do think having this low expectation does help. But that all being said, I don't think it's a deserved reputation. Eye of the World is fantastic in my opinion. It's one of my favorites in the entire series. Hopefully I did a good job of making my point when it comes to that.